It was 5 p.m. on Friday. I had just finished my sermon for today, the worship PowerPoint, everything. What a relief. I was curling up by the fire with a glass of wine and diving into the first few pages of a new book that had just come in, Sarah Bessey's A Rhythm of Prayer. A book about how prayer and listening for God comes in so many forms. Phrases floated out of the pages as I took them in. Who dared to wonder, what if I'm wrong? Wrestling until the blessing came. God's ears don't play favorites. It was somewhere here when I realized the very sermon I had just finished writing and recording about listening didn't even really contain any real practice of listening for God. It was a strangely busy week. Maybe the leak in Hanover Hall, the several pastoral visits and phone calls I made, the evening commitments. It was here that I realized I know why we aren't good at listening. It takes so much darn time. When was I supposed to relax? When was I supposed to take time to relinquish my to-do list to possibly hear God? But here we are in a season all about time. Set in a time when I've noticed that the sun is rising earlier and earlier and setting a little later each night. The days are lengthening, and Lent is living into her name. I began to wonder how we can lengthen and stretch ourselves to reach toward God in this season. Lent calls us to many things, and this morning we are reminded to listen. Again and again, we are called to listen to God and to each other. We do a lot of listening on any given day to the radio or television and Zoom calls. We listen to obtain information. We listen to understand. We listen for enjoyment. We listen to learn. We are all about listening until it's something that we don't like to hear, or what we hear calls us on a different course than what we had planned in our heads. And I think this is where we find Peter this morning. By the time we reach chapter 8 in the Gospel of Mark, the disciples have been following Jesus around, watching him heal and multiplying loaves and fishes, learning about the kingdom of God and contemplating parables. They are listening and absorbing all these new teachings. And things seem to be going well until Jesus starts talking about his death. The disciples don't want to hear this. This is crazy talk because this changes everything. Peter and the other disciples have risked everything to follow Jesus. They left what they knew, their family, their business, their tribe, to follow this man they hope is the Messiah. They are waiting for that messianic payout, a new kingdom of God that will come to pass and one that will bring justice and equity for all, where all have access to food and healing, where the misaligned powers are put back into their place. This is the good news that they have been waiting to hear. But how will any of that come to pass if Jesus is dead? Peter blurts out that common idiom we all use when we are striving to not embrace what is right in front of us, be that a piece of chocolate cake or Jesus's death on the cross. "Get behind me, Satan." Peter doesn't want to reimagine. Peter doesn't want to change course. He likes where they are and where they are going. It's all fine with him. So Peter rebukes Jesus for the words that he hears. And Jesus, in return, rebukes Peter for not being willing to listen. Lent calls us to listen. Again and again, we are called to listen to things that are easy and things that are hard. The disciples thought they had it all figured out. And Jesus stretches their imaginations even more. He pushes them out of their comfort zone as if to say, don't ever get too comfortable with what you think God is doing in the world. Now, this is excruciatingly difficult because us humans, we cling to power. We cling to what is comfortable and easy. We cling to what we understand. And this doesn't make us bad, it just makes us human. It is what leads us to say, it's always been done that way. A psychological study about why we cling to our views so tenaciously was found that it is because the walls of our opinions are like battlements that keep us good guys safely inside from the enemy, those dopes with different opinions than ours, out. Quite literally, our views and opinions may protect us, keep us safe, and help us survive. It takes so much time we don't think we have to reconsider our views. It takes mental energy and critical thinking and significant humility. And even with all that, it's overwhelming to try to navigate. Quite possibly, the result will demand changes in our life or lifestyle that we're just not willing to make. Most recently, I've become aware of the forced labor camps of the Uyghur community, a Muslim minority in China. It is believed that at least 1 million adults from the Uyghur community are being imprisoned, subjected to forced ideological and behavioral re-education. And they are forced to make PPE, like the masks we've been wearing, as well as other cheap products for well-known global companies such as Apple, Nike, BMW, and Samsung. The goal is to assimilate this minority community into Chinese society. And even though I now know this, even though I think it is an awful violation of human rights, the same finger I used to click on the article that uncovered this story of oppression, I continue to use to click on my next Amazon purchase. Too overwhelmed to consider how I could possibly make a difference, and honestly unwilling to make the personal changes in my life, I press on with my day, unwilling to hear God's call. But then I hear Jesus say, "For those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life?" Quite simply, Jesus is telling us that souls matter. Loving our neighbor matters. Showing up matters. Authenticity matters. Finding meaning matters. Reconciliation matters. Understanding that just because my life is good doesn't mean that everyone else's life is good. And in the words of Paul, if one member suffers, all suffer with it. A life of following Jesus isn't about safety. It isn't just about merely surviving. It's about everyone flourishing, everyone thriving. And that's hard. And so we just usually avoid it and move on until we are reminded again. Peter and the disciples hear Jesus as he talks about his death. They hear him rebuke Peter. They hear him make another appeal to the crowd about what it is he came to do. They hear Jesus and they move on. Just like I read that article about the Uyghurs and then kept clicking on Amazon, life goes on as we know it, and we go back to what we know. Like a scene around the family table, I imagine Peter secretly praying that no one asks Jesus about that death talk. Don't bring up that topic. I imagine the disciples are walking on eggshells for a few days, tiptoeing around the subject of suffering, rejection, and death until it is all but forgotten. And it is forgotten, it sounds like, for a few days. 6 days, actually. And then the disciples have another transformative moment with God, and one that we are quite familiar with. Peter, James, and John go on a hike with Jesus. And while they are on that hike on a mountain, Jesus is transfigured before them. There is an illumination of light that is so bright, so intense, it embodies excitement and hope. This is no sign of death. On the contrary, this illumination points to life and lots of it. Elijah and Moses show up. They even hear the voice of God. I can imagine Peter being like, yes, this is what I'm talking about. Let's press the pause button right here, Jesus. Let's keep this moment. Let's stay here because this moment feels so good. So let's build some monuments, some structures so that we can remember, because that is, after all, how we capture God. That is, after all, how it has always been done. Again and again, the disciples cling to what they know. They cling to what is easy and cling to what they understand and feels good. Again and again, we cling to what we know, what is easy, and what we understand. And we reaffirm in our certainty that is the way that it's always been done. The Lenten journey calls us to examine the things in which our hearts are invested. How important is comfort to us? Are we willing to listen to hard truths and be changed by them, even if it is difficult? Or are we committed to the status quo because though it may be imperfect, it is at least familiar? Again and again, we are implored to listen, especially when what we hear is unsettling. Are we willing to tune our sensors heavenward despite the difficulties along the way? And let me assure you that there are difficulties. What is next is difficult and includes suffering, pain, humiliation, abandonment, and death. Indeed, we are halfway between baptism and the cross. Our faith calls us to be invested in the wholeness of people, in the acknowledgement of each human as a beloved child of God. We put our faith, hope, and love into the one that puts their faith, hope, and love into each of us. And therefore, we are called to be committed to hard conversations and difficult truths. But we know how to do hard things. We are familiar with hard conversations. Those of you who have ever served in our church leadership know the struggle to balance the realities of serving the institution versus God's call. And we've navigated difficult conversations in our personal lives when deciding on end-of-life care for our partners or learning what it means to have a child that doesn't fit into the gender norms society has created. And our communities have had hard conversations about how to provide healthcare aimed at prevention rather than picking up the pieces when someone becomes ill or injured, depressed, or addicted. And we've been having hard conversations about how to restructure policing that is aimed at preventing crime rather than catching and punishing criminals. These are difficult conversations, but when we are committed to them, can bring about the presence of the kingdom of God here on earth as in heaven. Conversations that can free us to live into stronger and deeper connections, authenticity, and vulnerability, making it possible to catch even a glimpse of the beloved community of God. If we lean in to listen and be present to the discomfort of hard truths, we might just find some good news beyond. Good news that we couldn't have even imagined. The disciples assumed that all those healings and preachings of the beloved community of God was the end of the good news, but it wasn't. There was so much more. And they think that the transfiguration was as good as it gets, that it is the culmination of Jesus's ministry, but that is not the case either. We know that there is still more. Unlike the disciples at this point in the story, we are privileged to know the ending. So we know that not even death is the end of the story. So what else might we hear if we listen to God? How might we be transformed by God and each other if we are willing to listen? Allow me to leave you with a charge from an excerpt from a poem by Amina Brown called "How Do You Know When You Are Hearing from God?" To hear from God, you have to be willing to experience what's holy in places many people don't deem to be sacred. That sometimes God sits next to you on a bar stool, spilling truth to you like many beers. That God knows very well the dance we'll do when we love ourselves so little that just about anyone will do. That God cares about the moments we find ourselves on the edge of a cliff, on the edge of sanity, on the edge of society. Even when we have less than an inch left of the thread that's been holding us together. So many of us are still searching, still questioning, still doubting. I know I don't have all the answers. I know I never will. That sometimes the best thing we can do is put our hands in the middle of our chest and feel the rhythm there, and turn down the noise in our minds, in our lives, and whisper, God, whatever you want to say, I'm here. I'm listening. Amen.